The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and merciless. It was nearing midnight in the ER at Memorial General Hospital, and the air was thick with tension and disinfectant. Every plastic chair in the cramped waiting room was filled. People coughed, groaned, and whispered complaints under their breath. A baby wailed in the corner. Somewhere down the hall, a code blue was called, and the world briefly stood still. Michael Thompson sat hunched on the last seat by the vending machine, his hoodie soaked through from the freezing Boston rain outside. His arms cradled Sophie, his 6-year-old daughter, her head tucked into his chest, her forehead burned against his chin. She was hot to the touch, her breathing shallow and wheezy, the unmistakable signs of another asthma attack. He'd already used her emergency inhaler twice. He hadn't meant to wait this long. But by the time his shift at the site ended demolition cleanup with no overtime, the clinics were closed. The ER was his only option, and tonight it looked like half of Boston had the same idea. His eyes flicked toward the admissions board. Thompson. Michael blinked on the screen. Relief bloomed in his chest, sharp and almost painful. He whispered against Sophie's damp hair. "Just a few more minutes. Baby, we're almost there." That's when it happened. The automatic doors hissed open with a rush of icy wind. A woman stumbled through, half running, half falling. She was drenched to the bone, her thin coat clinging to her, streaked with rain and something darker blood. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and as she moved forward, she coughed violently into her hand. Then she collapsed hard right onto the linoleum floor. Gasps rippled through the room, but no one moved. People shifted uncomfortably, muttering. "Junkie," someone whispered. "Probably drunk," another said. A security guard started toward her, but hesitated when she curled into herself and began coughing up more blood. Michael stared, frozen. The woman looked barely older than 35. Her clothes weren't cheap, just worn. Her boots were expensive but muddy. Her fingernails were painted but chipped. A nurse at the front desk called out, "Thompson, Mr. Thompson, room 3 is ready." He blinked, stood. Sophie stirred weakly against him, letting out a small whimper. The nurse repeated, impatient now. "Sir." Michael took a step forward, then stopped. The woman on the floor was struggling to sit up. Her breathing was ragged, and blood now stained the floor beneath her. The security guard was still standing back, unsure of whether to touch her. Nobody offered help. Nobody but Sophie. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Daddy, she's sick." Michael looked down at his daughter. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes glassy. She was still in danger. He knew that. But somehow, in her weakest moment, she was worried about a stranger. That did it. He walked straight to the reception desk. "Give her my spot." The nurse frowned. "Sir, your daughter. She's stable for now. She's had medication. Her breathing's not worsening. She can wait, but give it to her," he repeated firmly. The nurse hesitated, then finally nodded. "Get me a gurney," she called out. They rushed to the woman, lifted her gently, and wheeled her away. Michael returned to his seat, settling Sophie back onto his chest. She shivered, her little arms wrapping around him like ivy. "I'm proud of you, Daddy," she murmured, and he felt something twist in his chest. He pressed his lips to her forehead. "You make me braver than I am." An older man across from him, a heavy-set guy in a mechanic's jacket, snorted. "That's noble, but you might have just cost your kid her lungs." Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to explain it to a stranger. Because in the back of his mind, he saw Sarah, his wife, pale and sweating in their car 3 years ago, writhing in pain while Michael banged on a clinic door that was closed for the weekend. By the time they found a hospital that would take her, it was too late. That helplessness never left him. It lived inside him like a second heart. So tonight, he chose differently. A few minutes passed. Sophie dozed off against him, her breathing shallow but steady. Michael stared at the buzzing light above them, blinking slowly. He didn't regret what he'd done, but part of him was scared. He couldn't afford to lose her too. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the hallway. A tall man in scrubs, Dr. Warner, His badge, red, appeared at the front desk. He looked pale and shaken. "Who brought her in?" he demanded. "The woman. Who sent her in?" The nurse hesitated, pointing at Michael. He gave up his spot, said she needed it more. Dr. Warner turned to stare at Michael, then back at the nurse. "I need her chart, now." He tapped on the tablet in his hand. When the name loaded, his face changed. He went still, silent. "Then get the administrator on the phone. Tell them we have Catherine Reynolds in critical care." The room fell quiet. The nurse blinked. The Catherine Reynolds from Dr. Warner nodded once. Michael, still rocking Sophie gently in his arms, didn't notice the way everyone was suddenly looking at him. He had no idea that the woman he just saved was one of the most powerful names in the city. No idea that his single act of kindness was about to change everything. Michael sat perfectly still, his arms wrapped protectively around Sophie, the weight of her small body grounding him. The antiseptic-scented air buzzed with whispers now. A woman who had been silent for hours suddenly leaned over and asked, "Did the doctor say Catherine Reynolds, as in North Star Medical?" Michael looked at her blankly. "Who?" The woman's eyes widened. "She's the CEO. One of the youngest in the country. Just took over North Star a few months ago. She's worth, I don't know, a fortune." Michael blinked. It didn't mean much to him. He had no stocks, no savings. The only green in his wallet was the crumpled $5 bill he'd kept in case Sophie needed water or crackers from the vending machine. The only fortune he understood was the quiet rhythm of his daughter's breathing against his chest, across the room. A nurse on the phone was murmuring in hushed urgency. Another typed something rapidly at the front desk. The room, once full of restless patients and low groans, was suddenly alert, buzzing like a shaken hive. But Michael tuned it all out. He shifted Sophie slightly, cradling her closer. She stirred, whimpered softly, and mumbled, "Is the lady okay?" "I think so, sweetheart," he whispered. "They're taking care of her." Sophie nodded sleepily. "She looks scared." "Yeah," he swallowed. "She was." Michael's mind drifted to his wife, Sarah, and the night she died. The memory was like an old scar, faded, but still tender. He had taken her to a small clinic when the abdominal pain wouldn't stop. She'd insisted it was probably food poisoning, but by the time they were redirected twice due to non-emergency status, her appendix had ruptured. By the time someone finally took her in, it had turned septic, and just like that, she was gone. He remembered begging the receptionist to push her up the list. Remembered the way they'd looked at him, just another broke guy with no insurance. Nothing he could say or do made a difference. That night had taught him something brutal. Sometimes kindness wasn't enough to save someone. But maybe tonight, it was. He held on to that thought. A man in a charcoal blazer hospital security approached. "Mr. Thompson." Michael stiffened. "Yeah. Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" Sophie stirred again, her arms tightening around his neck. He kissed her temple. "I'm right here, baby. Just talking." The guard led him toward the hallway where it was quieter, away from the curious stares. They passed a nurse's station. Two staffers glanced up, then immediately looked away, whispering to each other the moment he passed. In the corner of a sterile hallway stood Dr. Warner, tall, gray-haired, sleeves rolled up past his elbows. His face was calm but studied Michael with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Mr. Thompson," the doctor said, offering his hand. "I wanted to thank you personally." Michael shook it, confused. "I didn't do anything special. You did something very few would have done. You gave up your daughter's place in line for someone you didn't know." Michael's eyes flicked down the hallway. "She looked like she was dying. What was I supposed to do? Walk past? That's just it," the doctor said quietly. "Most people do." Dr. Warner hesitated, then glanced around before lowering his voice. "The woman you helped tonight is Catherine Reynolds. She's not just a CEO. She's the executive director of our hospital's largest funding partner. She has more influence on the operations of this place than anyone short of the board of directors. And tonight she came in off the street, No security detail, no entourage, no assistant. She didn't want anyone to know. Michael frowned. Why? We don't know. She may have wanted to observe the ER on her own terms. See how her foundation's funding affects real lives. It's something she's known for blending in. Seeing the cracks no one reports in spreadsheets. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. I didn't recognize her. You weren't supposed to, but now. Dr. Warner's gaze softened. Now she wants to speak with you. Personally. Michael shook his head. Look, I didn't do it for thanks. I just did what felt right. My daughter's still sick. We just need to be seen and go home. And we'll make that happen, Warner said gently. But I think you should talk to her. She asked for you by description, specifically the man in the hoodie with the little girl. Michael hesitated. Sophie was still unwell, but deep down, a part of him wondered what kind of woman remembers kindness through pain. He sighed. Let me check on my daughter first. They returned to the waiting room. Sophie was curled up in the chair, small and still, cheeks flushed but peaceful. A nurse knelt beside her, monitoring her breathing. She looked up as Michael approached. She's stable, the nurse said kindly, but we'll get her in next. Promise. Michael touched his daughter's hand. Be right back. Champ. Sophie opened one eye. The lady, she's awake. She wants to say thank you. Michael nodded. Sophie smiled weakly. She'll like you. Michael's throat tightened. He followed the guard through a set of restricted doors and down a quiet hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fresh paint. As they reached room 6B, the guard gestured toward the partially open door. She's awake. Michael took a breath and stepped inside. The room was softly lit. Catherine Reynolds lay on the bed, an IV in her arm. Her skin was pale but no longer ashen. Her sharp gray-blue eyes met his the second he entered. She smiled faintly. You stayed, she said. I wasn't sure if you would. I almost didn't, he admitted. She studied him, then looked past him as if visualizing the whole ER again. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't hesitate. Why? Michael stepped closer, folding his arms. Because you needed help. That was enough. For a long moment. Neither of them said anything. Then she whispered, almost to herself. It's never enough, until someone decides to make it enough. Michael didn't understand what she meant not yet, but something in her tone and the fragile steadiness of her voice made him realize this meeting was only the beginning. Dr. Warner had worked in emergency medicine for over 30 years. He had seen gang violence, pile-up collisions, opioid overdoses, and young mothers who gave birth in waiting rooms with no one by their side. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the moment he tapped the screen of his hospital tablet and saw the name flash back at him. Catherine Marie Reynolds. He read it again, thinking perhaps exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. But there it was, bold, unmistakable. Catherine Reynolds, CEO of North Star Medical Holdings, one of the youngest executives in the country, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, and recently appointed director of the foundation that had single-handedly saved their ER from shutting down during the budget crisis, the very foundation that bore her family's name. And she was here, alone, bleeding in his emergency ward, and she had entered without announcement, without protection, without pretense. He turned to the attending nurse beside him, voice a notch above a whisper. Page Hospital Administration. Now, the nurse blinked. Wait, you mean that Catherine Reynolds? Get security to clear the hallway, and do it quietly. No leaks. In room 6B, Catherine lay still, her breathing slower now, more controlled thanks to the IV fluids and stabilizers. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind, always sharp even under strain, was racing. She had tried to enter the hospital unnoticed. She hadn't told her assistant. She hadn't brought her driver or security detail. The entire point of tonight was to see truly, see how her hospital served the people it claimed to help. But the pain had been worse than she expected. The stress bleeding ulcer, likely triggered by weeks of sleepless nights and mounting pressure, had erupted suddenly, violently. She had barely made it inside, and then she remembered him. the man in the soaked hoodie, the little girl in his arms. The warmth in his voice when he told the nurse to take her instead. His eyes had been tired but not bitter, wary but not cold. It wasn't just that he gave up his place, it was how he did it, quietly, without fanfare, without asking for anything in return, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, out in the waiting room, whispers were spreading like wildfire. A young man in a denim jacket leaned toward a woman holding a baby. "They're saying that woman's some kind of billionaire." A nurse nearby hushed them sharply. "Keep your voice down. No gossiping." But it was too late. Every patient waiting now knew something was happening. Some looked impressed. Others rolled their eyes. Only Michael remained unmoved, sitting beside Sophie, who was now being wheeled toward an exam room by a nurse. "You'll be okay, Pumpkin," he whispered, stroking her damp hair. Sophie smiled through cracked lips. "Is the lady okay too?" He nodded. "She's doing better." "Good," she whispered. She looked sad. The observation hit him harder than he expected. Sad. That woman had looked terrified, sick, vulnerable, but sad. Back in the hallway, Dr. Warner stood facing the hospital's director of operations, a woman named Rebecca Lawson. She had rushed down in heels and a blazer still wrinkled from her car seat belt. "You're absolutely sure it's her?" Rebecca asked. "I just spoke with her. It's her, and she doesn't want media attention. Says she came alone for a reason." Rebecca cursed under her breath. "This could either make or break our funding for the next 5 years." Warner nodded grimly. "We've got to handle it right." Rebecca hesitated. "Who was the man that brought her in?" "He didn't bring her in. He gave up his daughter's spot in line so she could be seen." Rebecca's jaw dropped. "Seriously?" "Seriously." They exchanged a look that spoke volumes. In their world full of donors who liked to be praised and patients who often felt entitled, that kind of sacrifice was rare, almost extinct. Inside room 6B. Catherine sat up slowly as Michael stepped inside. The lighting was low, the kind of soft calm she usually despised in corporate meetings, but welcomed now. He stood near the door, awkward and hesitant. "You didn't have to send for me," he said quietly. "I did," she replied. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "All I did was give up a turn in line." "Anyone would have," she smiled faintly. "No, Mr. Thompson, that's where you're wrong. Very few people would have done that, not with a sick child in their arms." Her eyes softened. "Especially in this country." Michael didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say to a woman like this. Someone who had power and presence but spoke like someone who understood pain. "I saw you," she said. "Before I passed out, you didn't even hesitate. That's not normal." He shrugged. "I didn't do it to be noble. I did it because I know what it's like to wait too long. My wife, she died because we were sent away once. It never leaves you." Catherine's eyes glistened. "I'm sorry," he nodded, folding his arms, suddenly needing distance from the emotion pressing in. "I don't want anything from you," he said firmly. "No press, no stories. My daughter and I, we just want to get back to normal." Catherine nodded slowly. "And you'll have that. But just so you know, this moment it won't go unnoticed. Not by me." There was a long pause, and then she added, more quietly, "There are people who try to change the system from the top down. I've been trying for years. But you did it from the bottom up, just by doing the right thing. No cameras, no spotlight, just human decency." Michael shifted. Her words struck somewhere deep and uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being seen. "Not like this." Catherine smiled again, and this time it was lighter. "I don't know who you are, Mr. Thompson, but I intend to find out." Back in the hallway, Rebecca was already drafting a quiet internal memo. No press releases, no grand gestures yet, but she knew the story wouldn't stay quiet forever, because sometimes the smallest kindness in the darkest moment becomes the story that changes everything. The hallway lights flickered once, just a glitch in the old wiring, but enough to jolt Michael back into focus. He stood just outside Catherine's room now, the sterile smell of antiseptic curling around him. A nurse had just updated him Sophie was being examined, and her breathing had stabilized. She'd likely be discharged with a prescription and an inhaler refill. Relief seeped into his bones like warmth after a bitter wind. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to exhale. But what lingered wasn't relief. It was the way Catherine had looked at him, as if she saw something in him even he couldn't name. Not pity, not admiration. Something quieter, something deeper. He sat again in the waiting room while they finished with Sophie's paperwork. The chair squeaked under him, around him. The room had quieted. New patients trickled in. But the earlier electricity had faded. The drama had passed. What remained was exhaustion and memory. 2 years ago, the old Ford sputtered outside the urgent care center. Michael had parked illegally. There was no time to find a proper spot. Sarah was doubled over in the passenger seat, clutching her stomach, her voice weak and tremulous. "We just need to be seen." He'd begged the front desk nurse. She hadn't even looked up. "If you don't have insurance, you'll need to go to County General. It's 20 minutes away." "She's in pain," he'd said. "Please." "I'm sorry," the woman had replied, her tone automatic. "We're not authorized to treat uninsured patients with potential surgical needs." By the time they reached County General, Sarah had passed out. Septic shock. Too late. Too late. A small voice broke through the fog. "Daddy?" Michael looked up. Sophie stood in front of him, a nurse beside her holding a discharge folder and a plastic bag of medications. "She's all set," the nurse said with a kind smile. "She was very brave." Michael stood, kneeling to Sophie's level and brushing a curl away from her cheek. Her skin was cooler now, her eyes clearer. "You okay, Munchkin?" She nodded. "They gave me stickers." He chuckled softly. "Then I guess we're good." But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she tilted her head, peering up at him with that too-old look she sometimes wore. Sarah's look, thoughtful, steady. "You look sad again," she said softly. He tried to smile. "Just tired." "Is it because of Mommy?" Michael froze for a moment, then nodded a little. Sophie looked down. "I miss her." "Me too." She leaned against him, her small hands curling into his coat. "You helped the lady tonight," she said. "Just like you wanted someone to help Mommy." Michael's throat tightened. "Yeah. Mommy would be proud of you." He didn't respond right away. What could he say to that instead? He wrapped his arms around her and held on. They walked toward the exit together, Sophie's little hand tucked in his, the bag of meds swinging in his other hand. The night rain had turned to a drizzle, just a whisper against the pavement. His truck sat under a flickering street light, one headlight out. One door that didn't shut right, but it was theirs. It got them here. As he opened the door for Sophie, a voice behind him stopped him. "Mr. Thompson?" He turned. It was Dr. Warner again, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing just behind him was Rebecca Lawson, crisp in a navy coat and sharp heels, her posture polished and practiced. "Sorry to stop you," Rebecca said. "I'm the director of operations here." Michael tensed. "Is there a problem?" "Not at all," she said quickly. "Quite the opposite. Ms. Reynolds asked me personally to speak with you. She understands you may not want attention, but, well, she doesn't forget people." Michael shifted Sophie behind him slightly. "I appreciate that, but like I told her, I'm not looking for anything." Rebecca smiled a little softer now. "I understand, but you should know. Your story made its way through our staff tonight, and I don't think anyone here will look at that waiting room the same again." Michael said nothing. He wasn't sure what to say to a woman who looked like she managed half the city's budget from her phone. Rebecca extended a business card. "If you ever want to talk about anything job placement, community partnerships, just consider us a resource." He hesitated, then took it, tucking it into his wallet. "Thanks." Rebecca nodded, gave Sophie a little wave, and disappeared back into the hospital. The truck was cold when he started it, the heater groaning to life slowly. Michael glanced at Sophie, now buckled in, fiddling with her stickers. "You still thinking about the lady?" he asked. She nodded. "Will we see her again?" Michael shrugged. "I don't know." Sophie was quiet a moment. "She looked lonely." Michael turned to her. "What do you mean?" "She looked like someone who didn't have a daddy like you." That hit him harder than he expected. He looked out the windshield, the hospital glowing behind them, its neon red emergency sign blinking into the dark. Maybe they would never see Catherine again. Or maybe this wasn't the end of their story. He shifted into drive, his voice quiet but steady. "We'll see where the road takes us." That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in her small twin bed, and the house was finally quiet, Michael pulled out the card Rebecca had given him. He stared at it for a long while. Then he slipped it into Sarah's old recipe box on the kitchen shelf. Not to forget, but to remember when the time was right. Because sometimes the past couldn't be changed, but the future that was still unwritten. Morning broke with a haze that painted Boston in soft silver, atop the high floors of North Star Medical's corporate tower. Catherine Reynolds sat wrapped in a thick sweater on her office couch, a mug of tea cooling beside her. She hadn't returned home the night before. Against her assistant's frantic advice, she'd insisted on discharging herself as soon as the IV fluids had stabilized her vitals. Catherine hated being coddled. She hated looking weak. But most of all, she hated pretending she hadn't been changed by that night. Her hospital visit was supposed to be anonymous, a spontaneous drop-in to gauge how the system her name funded truly worked. But things had unraveled fast. The ulcer had ruptured. The bleeding had come without warning. She hadn't even made it to the receptionist's desk before the world blurred, and she collapsed. And then him, Michael Thompson. That moment looped in her mind like a song she couldn't unhear. The image of him, soaked to the bone, a child shivering in his arms, exhaustion carved into his posture. Yet he still gave her his place in line, not for attention, not to be noble, just because he saw someone who needed help more than he did. Catherine had known 100 men more powerful than Michael. Not one of them would have done what he did. She rose from the couch slowly and walked to the tall windows that looked down over the river. People below looked like ants rushing to work, bundled in coats, hunched against the morning chill. All strangers, and yet somehow, that man that father felt closer to her than the board of directors sitting 3 floors below. There was a knock. Catherine turned. "Come in." Her assistant, Emma, entered cautiously, holding a tablet and a concerned expression. "You're supposed to be home," Emma said carefully. Catherine waved it off. "I'm fine." "That's debatable." "I'm functioning." "That's still debatable." Catherine managed a smirk. Emma, who had worked for her for 3 years, was one of the few people who didn't tiptoe around her status. She appreciated that, especially today. Emma sat on the edge of the leather chair and held up the tablet. "I pulled the internal footage from the ER lobby like you asked. No audio, just video. But it's all there. The moment he stood up, the way he talked to the nurse, you can even see the girl whisper something to him before he decides." Catherine leaned forward as the footage played. She watched herself stumble in, watched her own body fall. But more than that, she watched Michael's. The stillness before movement, the glance at his daughter, the hesitation, then the decision. He stood, he walked, he didn't look back. "Pause it," she said softly. Emma froze the frame where Michael gently handed his daughter back her jacket, ruffling her hair before turning to the desk. Catherine swallowed hard. "He looks tired." "He is," Emma replied gently. "I had the team run a quiet background check, just based on hospital info. He's a single dad, construction worker, widowed, lives in Oak Ridge. No legal issues, no complaints, no debts, but also no savings." Catherine turned from the screen. "Did he call the number I left for him?" Emma shook her head. "Not yet. He will, or he won't." That gave Catherine pause. "He didn't ask for a reward," Emma said. "He didn't even ask who you were. You think maybe that's what made you notice him, but maybe it's what makes him different." Catherine looked away, her jaw tight. I owe him my life. Maybe, Emma said gently. Or maybe you owe him something else. That afternoon, Catherine made a phone call to a name she hadn't spoken in years, Martin Fisher, her mentor and one of the founding board members of the Reynolds Foundation. He answered on the second ring. Catherine, he said, I heard you were in the ER last night. News traveled fast. I'm fine, she replied, but I need to make a personnel decision that doesn't go through traditional channels. There was a pause. Go on. I want to offer a field leadership position to someone, a man named Michael Thompson, construction background, community roots, no formal degrees, but the kind of integrity we can't teach. You sure about this? I've never been more sure. He'll need to be vetted. He already passed the only test that mattered. Martin chuckled. This about gratitude or about vision? Catherine smiled faintly. Both. Later that evening, on the other side of the city, Michael sat at the kitchen table, sorting through unopened mail and junk coupons. Sophie was upstairs, humming to herself, her asthma finally calmed, her cheeks flushed from a warm bath. He opened a plain white envelope. Inside was a single typed note. Mr. Thompson, you saved a life. Let's talk about how you might help save more. Catherine Reynolds below it. A phone number. No pressure, no branding, just an invitation. He stared at it for a long time. Then, without thinking, he looked up at the recipe box on the shelf. Sarah's recipe box. The card from the hospital director was still there, tucked inside next to a handwritten apple pie recipe neither he nor Sarah had ever gotten around to trying. Michael wasn't a man who believed in signs, but maybe tonight he could make an exception, because maybe what he did in the ER wasn't the end of something. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning. The next morning began like any other in Michael Thompson's house. Quiet, simple, and a little frayed at the edges. The radiators hissed and clanked, struggling to push warmth through the drafty Oak Ridge duplex. The smell of instant oatmeal drifted from the kitchen as Michael stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of the one dress shirt he owned that didn't have a paint stain. He hadn't called the number yet. The note from Catherine sat on the counter beside his toothbrush, its crisp edges now slightly bent from how many times he'd unfolded and refolded it. You saved a life. Let's talk about how you might help save more. He had stared at that line for hours the night before, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle piece he wasn't sure where to place. He'd made decisions his whole life out of necessity: where to work, when to quit, which bills to pay first. But this felt like a decision about purpose, and purpose was harder. Sophie peeked around the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair a wild halo from sleep. Is that the lady's letter? Michael smiled gently. Yeah, baby, it is. You going to call her? He hesitated. I'm thinking about it. Sophie stepped closer, barefoot on the cold tile. She looked like someone who doesn't have people. Michael blinked. What do you mean? I don't know, Sophie said softly. She looked like she needed someone who isn't afraid to tell her the truth. Someone kind. Like you. Michael knelt, brushing her hair behind her ears. You're a lot smarter than your dad. She shrugged. I just see things. He made the call at 9:17 a.m. The line rang once, then twice, and then a familiar voice picked up. Michael Thompson. It was Catherine. Calm, composed, but there was something in her tone, something warmer than formality. Familiar. Even, I wasn't sure if you'd call, she said. I wasn't sure either. A beat of silence. Then she said, I'm glad you did. They met later that day at the Grove, a nonprofit community hub Catherine's foundation had helped rebuild 2 years ago. The center offered after-school tutoring, job skills workshops, and warm meals, all the things Michael wished had existed when he was a kid. He walked in and found Catherine waiting in a modest conference room, dressed casually this time: jeans, a navy blazer, and a simple ponytail. No designer labels, no entourage. She stood when he entered. Thanks for coming. He gave a half shrug. You asked. She gestured to a seat. I didn't want to meet in an office tower. I thought you'd appreciate something that felt real. He looked around the room. Worn chairs, handmade posters, a smell of crayons and old coffee. It did feel real. Catherine sat across from him, her hands clasped lightly on the table. I've been thinking a lot about the way we build change, she began. Most foundations operate from the top down. But what happened in that ER, what you did reminded me that the most powerful moments of change start small, human, unseen. Michael tilted his head. You want me to be a spokesperson? She smiled. No, I want you to work with me. He blinked. Doing what? Exactly. Project oversight, community liaison. You've got the experience in construction and, more importantly, you understand people who don't trust suits and slogans. He frowned slightly. I'm not a college grad. I've never written a grant. I've never even been on LinkedIn. Catherine leaned in. You have something better. You have credibility. You walk into a room, and people know you've lived what they're living, and that's not something I can teach. Michael looked down at his calloused hands. I'm not sure I belong in a place like this. You belonged in that ER more than anyone else in it, she said softly. And you didn't wait for permission to do what was right. He sat back. Processing? She waited. Then he asked quietly, Why me? Catherine hesitated, her eyes dropping for the first time. Because I used to be like Sophie. Michael looked up. I used to wait in ERs with my mom. We didn't have money. I learned early what it meant to be invisible. And when you grow up like that, you spend the rest of your life trying to matter, trying not to be powerless again. She looked at him then, her voice steady but thick with memory. I built a life with walls so high no one could touch me. But last night, I wasn't a CEO. I was just a sick woman on the floor. And you saw me, not because of my name, not because of my status. You just saw someone who needed help. Michael's throat tightened. Catherine continued, That's the kind of person I want building the future with me. They walked out together as the afternoon light stretched across the pavement. Kids were gathering near the entrance for after-school snacks. A teenage girl tripped on the steps, and Michael instinctively reached out to catch her elbow before she fell. She mumbled thanks and ran off, cheeks pink. Catherine watched quietly. You don't even notice when you do it. Do you? She asked. Do what? Step in, just help. Michael shrugged. I guess it's how I was raised, or maybe it's just who I became after losing someone. She nodded slowly. Loss has a way of shaping what we give. They stood by his truck, the moment stretching. You don't have to decide now, she said, but the offer is real, not because I owe you, but because I believe in what you can do. He looked at her and for the first time, saw not the CEO, not the name, but the woman behind it, human, flawed, grateful. I'll think about it, he said. She smiled. That's all I ask. That night, as he tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up and whispered, Was the lady nice? She was, he said softly. Will we see her again? Michael paused, brushing a curl from her cheek. I think we just might. Because maybe, just maybe, kindness wasn't a detour. It was the beginning of a new road. The phone call came 2 days later, while Michael was hammering drywall into a renovated 2-flat on 73rd Street. His old buddy Jake had thrown him the job for a week under the table. No benefits, but enough to cover groceries and Sophie's meds. He stepped outside when the phone buzzed in his pocket. Mr. Thompson, said the voice on the line. Polished. Professional, rehearsed. This is Alexis from North Star's executive office. Miss Reynolds asked me to extend an official thank you and to inform you that she's arranged a monetary gesture of appreciation. A gift of $20,000 has been allocated to your name. No strings attached. You can claim it at your convenience. Michael froze mid-step on the gravel path behind the building. His boots crunched into a spot of broken glass. He looked toward the sky, gray and low with impending snow. 20,000, he repeated slowly. Yes, sir. Miss Reynolds wanted to express her gratitude for what you did at the hospital. The funds can be wired immediately. He was silent, his breath fogging the air. That much money would change a lot. fix his truck, pay rent for 6 months, finally take Sophie to the dentist, maybe even buy her a new coat that didn't come from a donation bin. But the idea of taking something for what he'd done sat heavy in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. "I appreciate it, but I can't accept it." There was a pause. "I don't understand. I didn't help her because I thought it would come back to me. I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's enough." Another beat of silence. Then the voice replied, more gently this time. "I'll let Ms. Reynolds know." When Michael ended the call, he didn't feel noble or brave or virtuous. He just felt right. That evening, after dinner, he told Sophie. $20,000, she repeated, eyes wide. "Yeah," she blinked. "That's like 100 million stickers." He chuckled. "Something like that." "And you said no." Michael leaned forward on his elbows. "What would I be teaching you if I took that money for being kind?" Sophie's brow furrowed in deep thought. That being kind is worth money, or that it's only worth doing when money's involved. She looked down at her chipped pink plastic cup filled with milk, then nodded slowly. "I think you made the right choice." "So do I." Then she added, "But can we still get donuts this weekend?" He grinned. "Absolutely." The next morning, there was a knock on the door. Michael, half-dressed and carrying a mug of reheated coffee, opened it to find Catherine standing on a stoop. No driver, no security, just her, holding a bakery bag and 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you might not like suits showing up with envelopes," she said. He blinked. "How did you even know where I live?" She raised a brow. "Come on, I'm Catherine Reynolds." Michael stepped aside, stunned. "You came all the way here." "I wanted to look you in the eye when I said thank you for turning down the check." He scratched the back of his neck. "I wasn't trying to make a point." "I know," she said. "That's why it mattered." She looked around the small living room, clean but worn, the threadbare couch, the stack of library books, the hand-drawn pictures on the fridge. "Sophie's at school," she asked. "Yeah, loves it. Teacher says she's a natural leader." Catherine smiled. "Not surprising." They sat, and Michael took the coffee she handed him. "Jelly donut. I asked the bakery lady what a 6-year-old would choose. She didn't hesitate." He laughed. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "Maybe I didn't, but I needed to," she said. "You see, people give me things all the time. Praise, attention, partnerships. But what you gave me that night was different. It was dignity. In a moment when I felt anything but." Michael looked down at the donut. "I didn't think I was giving anything. That's what makes it rare." They sat in silence for a moment. The snow had begun to fall outside, soft and quiet. "I heard you're still thinking about the job," she said. "I am. What's holding you back?" He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I've spent most of my life trying to stay afloat, paying bills, surviving layoffs, patching holes literally and figuratively. I'm not used to thinking bigger. I don't know if I belong in your world." Catherine leaned forward. "What if I told you it's not my world? What if I told you I've been trying to rebuild a world where people like you set the foundation?" He looked at her, eyes narrowed. "You mean that? More than I've ever meant anything." He thought of Sophie, of Sarah, of the man he used to be, of the man he was trying to become. Then he nodded. "I'm in." Catherine smiled, genuine, unguarded. "Good, because I've already scheduled your orientation for Monday." He laughed. "Of course you did." As she stood to leave, Catherine turned at the door. "You know, I never believed in fate, but lately, I'm starting to think it believes in us." Michael leaned against the doorframe, coffee in hand, watching her walk down the snowy steps. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe kindness just has a way of circling back." And for the first time in years, as the snow fell gently across Oak Ridge, Michael Thompson didn't feel like a man surviving. He felt like a man beginning. Monday morning came dressed in quiet sunlight, the kind that slipped through windows without asking permission. Michael stood outside the towering glass doors of North Star's Community Development Division. his worn boots planted firmly on the concrete, his heart thudding a slow, uncertain rhythm. He had changed out of his usual hoodie and jeans. Today he wore clean khakis, a button-down shirt, and the one decent jacket Sarah had bought for him before she passed. Sophie had insisted he wear it, said it made him look like someone who builds bridges. Maybe she was right, because what he was about to step into felt a lot like crossing one. The lobby was warm and open, nothing like the corporate towers he'd imagined. There were photos of neighborhoods being rebuilt, murals painted by kids from local schools, and faces, real faces, smiling from framed project snapshots. It didn't feel like a place where suits barked orders. It felt like possibility. At the front desk, a kind-eyed receptionist smiled. "Mr. Thompson?" He nodded. "Ms. Reynolds is waiting for you upstairs." Catherine was in the conference room when he entered, standing beside a wall lined with blueprints and floor plans. She wore a slate-gray turtleneck and slacks, her hair tucked behind one ear. No makeup today, just herself, sharp and composed. "Morning," she said with a smile that didn't feel obligatory. "You really meant it." "Huh," Michael said, glancing at the plans. "I don't offer things I don't intend to follow through on." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, trying to wrap his head around what he was seeing. Diagrams of community centers, food banks, affordable housing, real places with real impact. "I thought you meant maybe some part-time advisory thing," he said. Catherine looked amused. "What I offered you is bigger. This isn't a charity job. It's a leadership position. Field manager for North Star's new initiative, Harvest Hope." She tapped the blueprint closest to her. "We're launching a pilot in 5 neighborhoods. Oak Ridge is one of them. We need people from the community to lead the teams that build the infrastructure, hire local workers, and ensure everything reflects the people it's meant to serve." Michael's brows furrowed. "And you want me to run one?" Catherine nodded. "Yes, you'll have support, training, a project team, legal resources. You won't be alone, but you'll be leading." He stared at the drawings, letting the weight of it settle. "I've led construction crews," he said slowly, "but I've never led something like this." "That's exactly why I want you," she said. "This isn't just about building walls. It's about building trust. You don't walk into a broken neighborhood with a clipboard and expect people to fall in line. You show up like you did that night. You see people. That's leadership." "Michael," he swallowed the emotion thickening in his chest, part awe, part fear. "I'm not used to being the guy people look to." Catherine stepped closer, her voice softer. "Then get used to it." They spent the next hour going over timelines, resources, and team assignments. Michael asked questions, good ones, and Catherine answered without condescension. When he voiced concerns, she listened, not just politely, but with interest. By the end of the meeting, he wasn't just considering the job. He wanted it. As they wrapped up, Catherine handed him a folder. "Read through this tonight. It's everything you'll need. First on-site meeting is Wednesday. I'll be there with you." Michael accepted it, glancing at the cover. Oak Ridge Site Plan Phase 1. Something about seeing his neighborhood's name in bold print on official letterhead stirred something in him. It felt like ownership, like redemption. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked. Watching her, Catherine paused, then said carefully, "Because when I was 8, my mom got evicted from our apartment in Roxbury. It was December. We slept in our car for 3 nights before a church took us in." Michael's expression softened. "I made a promise to myself," she continued. "If I ever had power, I'd build something that didn't forget people like her." She turned to him, eyes steady. "And I can't do it alone." He nodded slowly. "You won't have to." Later that afternoon, Michael picked up Sophie from school. She ran toward him, her backpack bouncing and hair flying in the wind. He scooped her up mid-stride, spinning her once before planting her gently on the ground. "You smell like sawdust and coffee," she said, wrinkling her nose. "Good. That's what progress smells like." She grinned. "Did you go to your new job?" "I did. And guess what? We're going to help rebuild places that help families." Sophie's eyes widened. Like the place with the soup and art supplies. Exactly like that. Are you the boss? He chuckled. Sort of, but it's more about helping the right people do the right work. She thought about that, then nodded, solemn. Mommy would like that. Michael blinked, the words hitting with soft, unexpected force. Yeah, he whispered. I think she would. That night, while Sophie colored at the table, Michael read through the folder Catherine had given him. It was thick with numbers, charts, zoning maps, but also handwritten notes in the margins. Notes in Catherine's looping cursive. Include local artist proposal here. Playground design community-led. Hire from within. No outsourcing unless absolutely necessary. Every page told the same story. This wasn't a vanity project. It was a mission. He looked over at Sophie, who was now sketching something with crayons. What are you drawing? He asked. She held it up. It was a building. A big one with windows and people holding hands on the roof. It's a place where nobody's cold and nobody's left out, she said proudly. He stared at it, heart swelling. That's a good place, he said. She beamed. You can build it. Right. Michael looked back at the plans, then at the girl who still believed anything was possible. I think I already am. The wind off Boston Harbor bit sharp that Wednesday morning, but it couldn't cut through the warmth building in Michael Thompson's chest. He stood at the edge of the vacant Oak Ridge lot, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning what would soon become the beating heart of something new. The ground was nothing but frost-bitten earth and gravel. Rusted fencing lined the perimeter. Graffiti scrolled across it in faded blues and reds. In the distance, a couple of kids on bikes slowed to watch the small cluster of people assembling near a white van emblazoned with the Harvest Hope logo. Michael had been in dozens of sites just like this, dead land forgotten by city planners and too risky for developers. But today was different. Today he was leading the crew. And this land wasn't just a project, it was a promise. Catherine arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of a black SUV with a travel mug and an energy that, despite her exhaustion, still somehow commanded attention. She approached Michael with a familiar smile. You showed up, she teased. I said I would. Yeah, but you wore a real shirt and everything. He chuckled, glancing down at his navy flannel. This is my real shirt. She sipped her coffee, eyes on the lot. Hard to imagine. In 6 months, this place will hold classrooms, a food pantry, a clinic wing, and a playground. Michael nodded. You know what I see? What? A patch of ground that's been waiting for someone to care. She turned to him then, something softer in her gaze. Then let's be the people who care. The morning kicked off with site introductions. Catherine spoke first, brief, confident, not a word wasted. She introduced Michael not as a contractor, but as project lead, when she said the words. A man whose heart is as steady as his hands. The crew of laborers, volunteers, and non-profit reps gave him their full attention. He felt the weight of it, and, surprisingly, it didn't scare him. He stepped forward and addressed the group, speaking not from notes, but from his gut. I know what it's like to feel forgotten, he said plainly, to stand on the wrong side of opportunity. But this project, this isn't about ribbon cuttings. It's about doing something with our hands and hearts that lasts longer than cement. It's about building a place where our kids feel safe, our elders feel seen, and no one walks through those doors wondering if they belong. Silence followed for half a second. Then someone clapped, then another, and soon the applause was real, genuine. From people who knew what it meant to feel invisible and saw in Michael someone who saw them back. By midday, the crew had begun clearing debris, setting up measuring tapes, staking the corners of the building. Michael moved through the lot like he belonged there, checking measurements, cracking jokes, offering help without barking orders. Catherine watched from a distance, arms folded across her chest, the winter air painting pink into her cheeks. You were right, said a voice beside her. She turned. Rebecca Lawson, head of operations, had arrived quietly, her wool coat catching bits of wind. He's not a polished exec, Catherine said. No, Rebecca agreed. He's better. They watched as Michael helped a teen volunteer from the local youth center tie rebar into the first support grid. The boy beamed at the praise. It was probably the first time anyone had called his work precise. "He connects without trying," Catherine murmured. Rebecca glanced sideways. "You trust him with this?" "Yes, and with more than this." Catherine hesitated because the truth was, she wasn't sure if the stirrings she felt when Michael looked at her were about admiration or something deeper. He wasn't part of her world. He didn't play power games or speak in polished metaphors. He was simple, grounded, solid. And maybe that's what scared her, or maybe what healed her. Around 2:00 p.m., a white-haired woman approached the fence. She wore a faded scarf and leaned on a walker. Michael noticed her immediately and walked over. "You need help." "Ma'am." The woman smiled. "No. Honey, I used to live in the building that stood here before they tore it down. Just wanted to see what was coming next." He looked toward the lot. "We're building something better," he said. Her eyes moistened. Then maybe all that pain wasn't wasted. He offered his arm, and she took it for balance. "What was it like?" he asked. She smiled. "Loud, full of kids." The walls were thin, but the laughter was thick. Michael grinned. "Then we'll build walls thick enough to hold the new laughter." That evening, Catherine found Michael in the back of the lot, rolling up measuring tape and brushing dust from his jacket. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that made the empty field look almost sacred. "You've got away with people," she said. He looked up. "I'm just listening." "Most people listen to respond. You listen to understand." He didn't respond right away, then said, "People don't need saving. They just need someone to stand beside them until they remember how strong they are." She nodded, looking out at the staked earth, already alive with energy. "I think this place is going to be something special." "It already is," he said, "because it's the first place I've been in a long time that doesn't make me feel small." Catherine turned to him. "Michael," she said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I don't think we met by accident?" He studied her a moment. "I'd say I don't believe in accidents anymore." And in the quiet between them, under the golden fading light of a city ready for change, something invisible but unmistakable began to build. Not with bricks, but with trust. The morning sun hit the windows of the nearly finished community center, glinting off the fresh glass panes like a silent anthem of progress. What once had been an empty, frostbitten lot was now alive with the sound of power tools, laughter, and purpose. Cement had dried into the bones of a building that meant more than shelter. It meant healing, inside the main hall. Michael knelt beside a newly installed bench, checking its bolts for the third time. His hands were rough, cracked from winter air and weeks of labor. But they moved with care, not just for the wood, but for what it symbolized. A place for someone to finally sit down and be seen. The center was nearly complete. The roof was sealed, the wiring passed inspection, and local kids had even helped paint a mural on the far wall. In it, a circle of people stood hand in hand beneath a tree with roots spreading in every direction. Harvest hope. It was Sophie who'd suggested the design, and Sophie who now came running through the double doors, her backpack thudding against her spine, her braids bouncing. "Daddy, Daddy, come quick!" Michael stood. "What's wrong?" She was out of breath but beaming. "It's the little boy from the apartments, the one with the big dog. He fell on the sidewalk by the alley. He's bleeding, and his arm looks weird. Miss Helen said she tried to call an ambulance, but they're delayed because of the pileup on 67th. Michael's heart seized. "Where is he now?" "They're bringing him here." Without another word, Michael grabbed his jacket and bolted outside. A crowd had gathered at the edge of the construction zone. Miss Helen, a retired nurse and local community leader, stood beside a small boy whose face was pale and pinched with pain. His arm hung limp at his side, twisted slightly. Blood ran down to his fingertips. "He fell off his bike," Miss Helen explained. "We called 911, but the dispatcher said they're backed up. I didn't know where else to go." Michael looked down at the boy, then over at the clinic wing of the community center, not officially open, but functional. "Bring him in." Someone hesitated. "But we're not licensed yet." Michael turned. We don't need a license to stop bleeding and stabilize a fracture. We just need a heart. He carried the boy gently in his arms, Sophie holding the boy's bike behind him like a soldier guarding treasure. Inside, Michael placed the child on one of the padded benches and called over Tina, Catherine's assistant, who happened to be helping catalog supplies that day. Tina had some EMT training, and, together with Miss Helen, they cleaned the wound and fashioned a splint. By the time the ambulance arrived 20 minutes later, the bleeding had stopped, the pain was managed, and the boy had stopped crying. A paramedic gave Michael a nod of genuine respect. Who set the fracture? Michael shrugged. Miss Helen, I just held his hand. The medic grinned. Good job. You saved us a lot of time. Catherine arrived minutes later, her car skidding slightly into the icy lot. I heard the call come through dispatch, she said breathlessly as she jogged toward the clinic doors. Is he stable? Michael nodded. He's on his way to the hospital now. Catherine took him in, dust on his sleeves, blood on his hands, sweat at his brow, and something inside her swelled with a pride that was unfamiliar but real. I guess this center passed its first test, she murmured. Michael gave a tired smile. It wasn't just the building. It was the people inside it. She stepped closer, her voice softer. People like you. He didn't answer right away. His chest rose and fell, the adrenaline still fading. I used to think my hands were only good for holding tools, he said. But lately, it feels like maybe they were meant to hold more. Catherine blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his voice. He turned to her. Thank you for not just seeing me, but trusting me. Catherine's eyes held his. Thank you for proving what I hoped was true, that doing the right thing still matters, that good men still lead. She hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from her coat. I wasn't sure when to show you this, she said. Handing it to him, Michael unfolded it carefully. At the top, it read, The Thompson Family Center dedicated to community, compassion, and second chances. Beneath was a rendering of the front of the building, and above the door, etched into a limestone slab, was his family name. Michael froze. I didn't ask for this, he said quietly. Catherine's voice was steady. I know. That's why you deserve it. His throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything. Just know that every child who walks through those doors, every parent who brings their kid in for help, every elder who finds warmth here, they'll be walking into something you built. Not just with your hands, Michael, but with your heart. He looked at her, then not as a CEO, not as the woman he once gave a place in line, but as Catherine, the woman who believed in things that didn't have price tags. And in that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but irrevocably. That night, back at home, Michael tucked Sophie into bed. She held his wrist before he could leave. Daddy, she asked. Yeah, baby. That boy, he's going to be okay. He's going to be just fine. She smiled sleepily. That building is magic. I told you. He kissed her forehead. You were right. She looked up at him through heavy lids. Is it still going to be ours? It always was. And outside in the quiet dark, the Thompson Family Center stood, no longer just brick and mortar, but a living testament to what one act of kindness could become when someone refused to walk away. Spring arrived gently that year, the kind that didn't trumpet its arrival but revealed itself through small kindnesses. Buds pushing through cracked sidewalks, coats traded for sweaters, laughter blooming in backyards, and in the heart of Oak Ridge, where a forgotten lot had once sat dormant beneath frost and rust. Something new now stood proud. The Thompson Family Center was open. It breathed, it sang, and it welcomed every soul who stepped through its wide glass doors. The grand opening wasn't flashy. No ribbon-cutting ceremony with city officials, no fireworks or media circus. That had been Catherine's call. This place isn't for headlines, she'd told her board. It's for the people who never make them. Instead, it was families, dozens of them, gathered in folding chairs on a sunny Saturday morning, holding paper cups of lemonade and watching their children race barefoot across the freshly seeded lawn. Local artists hung paintings in the hallways. Volunteers set up tables stacked with school supplies. Gently used clothes. Books donated from neighborhood churches and synagogues. There were faces from every walk of life, and at the center of it all, standing by the front door in a button-down shirt his daughter had picked out, was Michael Thompson. He greeted every guest not like a politician, like a neighbor. Miss Helen brought brownies and hugged him twice. The white-haired woman who once lived in the torn-down building wiped her eyes when she saw the mural her grandson had helped paint inside. Jake, the contractor who had given Michael odd jobs in darker times, showed up in a clean shirt and gave him a long, quiet handshake that said more than words ever could. Michael turned to see Sophie standing by the check-in desk, directing kids to the art room with a clipboard in her hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear like she owned the building. Catherine stood beside him, watching with a grin. "She's going to take over this place in 5 years," she said. Michael smiled. "Make it 3. They stood in silence, watching Sophie laugh with 2 boys over marker stains on their hands. Catherine glanced sideways. "Do you ever think about that night?" "The ER," she nodded. Michael looked out over the courtyard, where someone had just begun strumming an acoustic guitar. "I think about it every day. Not because I think I did something big, but because it reminded me that small things matter more than we ever know." Catherine was quiet a moment, then said, "I wasn't supposed to be at that hospital. I was supposed to be at a board dinner across town. I just couldn't face another room full of suits talking about problems they've never lived." "You walked into that ER looking for something," Michael said softly. "I did," she admitted. "I didn't know what, but I found you." He turned to her, his voice calm but full. "And I found something too. I found the part of myself I thought had died with Sarah." Her eyes softened. "I used to think purpose was something handed to people," he said, "that maybe I'd missed my shot, but then you walked in, and everything changed." Catherine reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Folded. Familiar. "I have something for you," she said. Michael unfolded it. It was a medical chart. His, or rather, Sophie's. The original ER intake form from that night. Her name. His name. The timestamp. And at the bottom, a line added later in bold black ink. Transfer of slot. Patient voluntarily gave up place in queue for another in critical condition. Underneath it, a handwritten note from the attending nurse. He didn't ask for recognition, but he deserves to be remembered. Michael stared at the page, his throat tight. Catherine touched his arm. "This is going into our archive at North Star, not because it's policy, because it's a reminder of what kind of world we're trying to build." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his inside pocket, over his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. "No," Catherine said, voice catching. "Thank you." As the sun climbed high, a small choir of neighborhood kids stood in front of the crowd and sang. Their voices weren't perfect, but they were true, clear, hopeful, rising into the breeze like a prayer made of joy. Michael sat beside Sophie in the front row, Catherine at his other side. The folding chairs creaked. A baby cried somewhere in the back. 2 teens laughed too loudly during a high note. And it was perfect, because it was real, because every person there knew what it meant to be seen, to be heard, to be offered a second chance. Later, as dusk painted the sky with streaks of lavender and gold, Michael walked the empty hallways of the center. The mural caught the last of the sun, the tree in the painting, its roots wide and tangled, its branches open, seemed to glow. He stopped beneath it, closed his eyes and let it sink in. This place, this life, this moment, none of it would have happened if he hadn't done something that didn't make sense on paper. Something unremarkable, something deeply human. He had simply chosen kindness. And now, written in stone above the entrance, shining under the stars, the Thompson Family Center, a place to begin again. And for Michael Thompson, and for Catherine Reynolds, and for everyone who ever wondered if the smallest act could really change the world, The answer now and forever was yes. 3 months after the center opened. Michael stood in the doorway of the newly completed health clinic wing, watching a young doctor named Lisa Chen arrange medical supplies with the methodical care of someone who understood that each bandage, each tube of antibiotic ointment, represented dignity for someone who might not find it elsewhere. She glanced up, sensing his presence. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a smile, "we're almost ready for the soft opening tomorrow." "It looks great," he said, stepping inside. "And please, it's Michael." Dr. Chen had been one of Catherine's most surprising recruits, a Harvard-trained physician who'd turned down lucrative offers to work in the center for a fraction of what she could earn elsewhere. When Michael had asked her why, she'd shrugged and said simply, "Because places like this saved my grandmother's life when she first came to this country." "Any last-minute needs?" Michael asked, scanning the room. "Just prayers that people actually come," she admitted. "Trust is hard to build in communities that have been burned before." Michael nodded. "They'll come. Word travels fast when something's real." As if on cue, the front door chimed, and voices echoed from the lobby. Miss Helen was leading a small group of elderly residents on a tour, her voice carrying down the hall. "And this clinic will see anyone, regardless of insurance status. No more being turned away. No more choosing between medicine and food." Michael caught Dr. Chen's eye. "See, the ambassadors are already at work." He excused himself and headed toward his small office in the back of the center. It was barely bigger than a closet, but he'd insisted on keeping it modest. "More room for what matters," he'd told the architects. Inside. He sank into his chair and pulled out his phone. 2 missed calls from Catherine. He was about to return them when there was a knock at his door. "Come in," he called. The door opened to reveal Dr. Mark Warner, the same doctor who had been on duty the night Michael gave up his spot in the ER. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his white coat. "Dr. Warner," Michael said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I heard about the clinic opening," Warner said, his voice carefully controlled. "And I wanted to offer my services. 1 day a week. Pro bono." Michael raised an eyebrow. The gesture was unexpected, especially since Dr. Warner had seemed firmly entrenched in the hospital system. "That's generous. But what's the real reason?" Warner's shoulders stiffened, then sagged. "May I sit down?" Michael nodded toward the chair across from his desk. The doctor sat heavily. He looked older than Michael remembered, more lines carved around his eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about what you did that night," he began. "Not just for Catherine Reynolds, but what it represented. A kind of medicine we've forgotten how to practice." Michael said nothing, waiting. 3 years ago, Warner continued, his voice dropping lower, "I was working at a different clinic. A woman came in with severe abdominal pain. Her husband was frantic. They had no insurance." Michael's heart began to pound. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. "I was following protocol," Warner said. "We were told to redirect non-urgent cases without coverage. I sent them to County General." Michael's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. Warner met his eyes. "I didn't recognize you at first that night in the ER, but later, when I checked your records, I saw her name, Sarah Thompson, your wife." The silence between them stretched, brittle and dangerous. "She died," Michael finally said, his voice a dry whisper. "Sepsis from a burst appendix." Warner nodded, a single, sharp movement. "I know. I looked up the case after I realized, and I've carried it with me every day since." Michael stood abruptly. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to make amends," Warner said. "Not to ease my conscience, nothing will do that, but to make sure it never happens to anyone else." Michael turned away, staring out the small window. Outside, children were playing on the new playground, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy weight in his chest. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said finally. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Warner replied. "I'm asking for a chance to be part of the solution instead of the problem." Michael turned back to face him. 1 day a week. To start, more if you need it. It won't bring her back. No, Warner agreed. Nothing will. Michael studied the man before him, not the confident doctor from the ER now, but someone humbled by the consequences of a system he'd participated in, someone seeking redemption. Thursday mornings, Michael said after a long pause. 8 to 2. We have a lot of seniors who come in then. Warner nodded, relief visible in his eyes. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Michael said. Prove it wasn't just talk. After Warner left, Michael sat motionless, trying to process what had just happened. The revelation should have reignited his anger, should have torn open the wound. Instead, he felt a strange, unexpected calm, as if some cosmic circle was slowly, painfully completing itself. His phone buzzed again. Catherine. This time he answered. Hey, he said. Hey, yourself, she replied. How's the clinic coming along? It's ready, he said. And you won't believe who just volunteered to work here. He told her about Warner's visit, about the confession, about the offer. When he finished, there was silence on the line. Catherine, he prompted. I'm here, she said softly. I'm just processing. Are you okay? I think I am, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. It doesn't change what happened, but maybe it changes what happens next. You're a better person than most, she said. Not better, just tired of carrying it alone. Catherine was quiet for a moment. I have something to tell you too. Something I should have told you sooner. There was something in her voice of vulnerability he rarely heard that made him sit straighter. What is it? It's about Sarah. Catherine said. Your wife. Michael's pulse quickened. What about her? Before I took over North Star, I was reviewing employee records from our charitable foundation. I found her name, Sarah Thompson. She worked there for almost a year, about 5 years ago. Michael closed his eyes. That can't be right. Sarah was a preschool teacher. Before that, Catherine explained, she was part of our community outreach team. She left when she went back to school for her teaching certificate. We never met. I was still finishing my MBA then, but she was there. Michael, in the same building where I work now. The coincidence was too precise, too perfect to be random. Why didn't you tell me before? At first, I didn't make the connection. Then, when I did, I wasn't sure how to bring it up. I thought it might be too painful. Michael leaned back in his chair, letting the revelation wash over him. Sarah had walked the same halls Catherine now commanded, had perhaps sat in meetings in the same conference rooms, had been part of the foundation that was now rebuilding his neighborhood. It's like, he started, like we were always meant to cross paths. Catherine finished, just not in the way any of us expected. The thought hung between them, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. I need to see you, Michael said suddenly. Not over the phone. I'm on my way to a board meeting, she replied, but I can be there by 6. I'll wait. The day passed in a blur. Michael moved through his duties mechanically, checking in with contractors finishing the playground safety surfacing, meeting with the food pantry coordinator about storage solutions, helping Sophie with her homework in the community room after school. But his mind kept circling back to the 2 bombshells that had landed in his life within hours of each other. Warner's confession, Sarah's connection to Catherine. It was as if the universe was systematically removing any possibility that their paths had crossed by mere chance. At 6:15, Catherine's car pulled into the parking lot. Michael watched from the window as she stepped out, not in her usual business attire, but in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger somehow, more like the woman who had stumbled into the ER that night, and less like the CEO whose name opened doors throughout the city. She found him waiting in the center's small kitchen, a pot of coffee brewing between them. Hi, she said simply. Hi. He pushed a mug toward her. Rough day. The board wants to expand Harvest Hope to 3 more neighborhoods before we've even seen the full results here, she sighed, taking the coffee gratefully. They mean well, but they think impact can be rushed. And you don't. I think real change takes time, like trust. She met his eyes. Like healing. He nodded, understanding she wasn't just talking about the project anymore. So, she said after a moment, Warner came to see you and confessed to being the doctor who turned Sarah away. Catherine shook her head. The coincidences keep piling up, don't they? I stopped believing in coincidences the night you collapsed in that ER. Michael said. He took a deep breath. Tell me about Sarah, about her work at the foundation. Catherine's expression softened. She was passionate. Everyone remembered her. She helped design an after-school reading program that we still use. There's actually a photo of her in our archives, from a fundraiser. I brought it for you. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, Sarah, younger than he remembered her last, laughing under string lights at some outdoor event, her arms full of books she was presumably delivering to children. I never saw this, he said, his voice thick. This was before we met. She made an impression, Catherine said gently, even on people who only knew her briefly. Michael stared at the image, his wife, vibrant and alive, doing work that mattered. Work that, in some cosmic symmetry. He was now continuing. I think she would have liked you, he said quietly. Catherine's eyes glistened. I wish I'd known her. Maybe in a way. You did. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of all these intersecting threads settling around them. Sophie wrote me a letter, Catherine said suddenly. Michael looked up, surprised. What? About a month after we met, she must have asked someone at school to help her find my address. It came to my office. What did it say? Catherine's smile was gentle. She told me that her daddy builds things that don't fall down, that her mommy went to heaven but still watches them, and that she thought I looked lonely like someone who needed a family. Michael's heart clenched. She never told me. She asked me not to tell you. Said it was a secret between ladies. He shook his head, amazed at his daughter's quiet perception. And was she right? About what? About you being lonely. Catherine didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. I built an empire to make sure I'd never be invisible again. But sometimes having everyone see your position means no one sees you. Without thinking, Michael reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her outside of a professional handshake. Her skin was warm, soft despite the strength he knew it contained. I see you, he said simply. She looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. I know. That's what scares me. Before he could respond, the kitchen door swung open. Sophie bounded in, crayon-stained fingers and a gap-toothed smile lighting up her face. Catherine, she exclaimed. You came! Catherine quickly wiped at her eyes, then opened her arms as Sophie launched herself into them. Of course I did. I heard you were the official welcoming committee for the center. Sophie beamed. I made name tags for everyone, even Mr. Jenkins. And he doesn't like name tags. That's diplomacy, Catherine said seriously. Very important skill. Sophie nodded sagely, then looked between the adults, her gaze suddenly shrewd beyond her years. Were you two having a grown-up talk? Michael cleared his throat. We were talking about the center. And other things, Catherine added. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly. Good other things or sad other things? A little of both, Michael admitted. Sophie seemed to consider this, then nodded decisively. That's okay. The best stories have both kinds. And with that piece of wisdom delivered, she grabbed a juice box from the refrigerator and skipped back out, leaving the adults staring after her. Sometimes I forget she's only 6, Michael said. Shaking his head, she's extraordinary, Catherine replied. But then, she's your daughter. The compliment lingered between them, warming the space. I should probably go, Catherine said finally. Early meeting tomorrow. Michael stood. I'll walk you out. They moved through the quiet center, most of the day's visitors and staff already gone, outside. The spring evening was mild, the sky painted in watercolor blues and pinks as the sun made its slow descent. At her car, Catherine turned to him. About what Sophie wrote in her letter. About you needing a family. She nodded. I've spent my whole life thinking I needed to stand alone to be strong. That needing people was a weakness I couldn't afford. And now, she met his gaze directly, now I'm not so sure anymore. Michael stepped closer, his voice low. For what it's worth, I spent 3 years thinking I'd never find room in my heart for anyone after Sarah, that I had to focus everything I had on Sophie and just survive. And now, she echoed his question, now I'm standing here wondering what happens when survival isn't enough anymore. When you start wanting more than just to make it through another day. Catherine's breath caught. What does happen, Michael? I think, he said carefully, you start building something new, not to replace what was lost, but because life keeps asking us to begin again. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. I like the sound of that. Me too, as she drove away. Michael stood in the parking lot long after her taillights had disappeared, feeling as though something monumental had shifted. Not an ending, not quite a beginning either, but perhaps the blueprint for one. The next morning, he arrived at the center early to find an envelope taped to his office door. Inside was a handwritten note from Catherine. Michael. Last night I couldn't sleep, thinking about all the threads that brought us here. Warner, Sarah, the ER, even Sophie's secret letter. Some might call it fate or destiny, but I think it's simpler than that. I think it's just what happens when people choose kindness over indifference. Again and again, until those choices create a path neither could have walked alone. Whatever comes next. I'm grateful our paths crossed. Catherine Michael folded the note and tucked it into his wallet, next to the photograph of Sarah, past and future, side by side. Both precious, both true, outside his window. The morning sun caught on the engraved stone above the center's entrance, the Thompson Family Center, a testament not just to what had been lost, but to what could still be found when you least expected it, and for the first time in longer than he could remember. Michael Thompson looked toward the future not with resignation, but with hope. The Boston summer arrived with a heat that clung to the skin like a memory that refuses to fade. The Thompson Family Center had been open for 4 months now, and what had once been just an ambitious blueprint had become a living, breathing part of the Oak Ridge community. The food pantry served over 200 families weekly. The after-school program had a waiting list. Dr. Chen's clinic was booked solid, with Dr. Warner's Thursday sessions becoming so popular they'd had to extend his hours, and Michael Thompson. Once just a construction worker struggling to make ends meet, now moved through the hallways with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his purpose. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Catherine called, her voice tight with an urgency he hadn't heard since that night in the ER. I need you at North Star. Now. What's wrong? He asked, already reaching for his jacket. The board meeting went sideways. Martin Fisher is pushing to redirect funds from Harvest Hope to a new pharmaceutical venture. He's calling it a more sustainable investment in community health. Michael's stomach clenched. Martin Fisher. Catherine's former mentor and the most powerful member of the board had been skeptical of the community-centered approach from the beginning. He preferred gleaming research facilities to neighborhood centers. What do you need from me? Michael asked. I need the real story. Not spreadsheets, not projections. The board needs to see what this project really means. I'll be there in 30. He hung up and found Sophie coloring with a group of younger children in the art room. Hey, Munchkin, I need to go help Catherine with something important. Miss Helen will take you home after your program. Okay. Sophie looked up, markers scattered around her like fallen soldiers. Is Catherine in trouble? Michael hesitated. Not trouble. She just needs backup. Sophie nodded solemnly. Then you have to go. That's what partners do. Partners, he repeated, the words settling warmly in his chest. That's right. The drive to downtown Boston took 25 minutes, the familiar skyline growing larger as he approached. He'd been to the North Star headquarters exactly twice before, once for his initial orientation and once for a project review. Both times he'd felt out of place among the polished glass and chrome. Today was different. Today he wasn't a visitor. He was an advocate. The security guard recognized him, which was surprising enough. "Mr. Thompson," he nodded. "Ms. Reynolds said to send you straight up. 14th floor boardroom." The elevator rose smoothly, its mirrored walls reflecting a version of Michael he still sometimes didn't recognize. Gone was the perpetual exhaustion that had shadowed his eyes for years. His posture was straighter, his gaze clearer. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, Emma, Catherine's assistant, was waiting. "Thank God," she breathed. "They've been at it for over an hour." Fisher brought in 3 financial analysts to argue his case. "And Catherine?" Emma's smile was grim but proud, holding her ground, "but she needs reinforcements." She led him down a corridor of glass-walled offices to a set of heavy double doors. Through them, Michael could hear the controlled cadence of Catherine's voice, the occasional deeper rumble of male interruption. Emma pushed the doors open without knocking. Every head turned as Michael entered. 12 people sat around a massive table of polished mahogany. Charts and graphs glowed on screens along one wall. At the head of the table, Catherine stood, one hand braced on the surface, the other gesturing toward a projection of the center's floor plan. Her eyes met his, relief washing over her face. "Ah, perfect timing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Thompson, our Oak Ridge site manager." Michael nodded, suddenly aware of his work boots and the faint smudge of paint on his sleeve. A dozen pairs of eyes assessed him, some curious, some dismissive. A silver-haired man at the far end of the table straightened. Martin Fisher. Michael recognized him from photos in Catherine's office. "Mr. Thompson," Fisher said, voice polished with the patina of old money. "How kind of you to join us. Perhaps you can help us understand why we should continue pouring resources into a program with such limited scalability." Michael held the man's gaze without flinching. "What would you like to know?" "Sir," Fisher gestured to one of the screens, where a complex financial model displayed projected returns. "Our analysts suggest that for the same investment, a targeted pharmaceutical initiative could serve 5 times the population." Michael stepped further into the room, moving to stand beside Catherine. "With all due respect, Mr. Fisher, people aren't numbers on a spreadsheet." "No," Fisher agreed smoothly, "but limited resources require strategic allocation. It's simple mathematics." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the presentation system. Catherine nodded, tapping a few commands on a tablet. "Go ahead." Michael connected his phone to the display. A moment later, the financial models were replaced by a simple video, shot on his phone just last week. No fancy editing, no soundtrack, just raw footage of the center in action. An elderly woman receiving her first eye exam in a decade. Children planting vegetables in the community garden. A teenage boy proudly showing off the resume he'd created in the Career Center. Miss Helen leading a diabetes management class for seniors. Dr. Warner gently setting a young girl's broken wrist. The same careful hands that had once turned Sarah away, now working to heal. The room fell silent as the images played out. Michael let them watch for a full minute before speaking. 2 months ago, a woman named Clara Rodriguez came into our center. She hadn't seen a doctor in 8 years because she couldn't afford it. Dr. Chen found a mass in her breast during a routine exam. Stage 2 cancer, treatable, but only because we caught it. He swiped to the next video, Clara, smiling despite her headscarf, surrounded by center volunteers preparing meals for her family during her chemo. Last week, a man named Joseph Taylor walked in, 73 years old, living on Social Security. His heat had been shut off because he couldn't pay the bill and was too proud to ask for help. He came for a warm meal and found a community that made sure his utilities were restored the same day. Another swipe, Joseph playing chess with a group of veterans in the center's common room. 3 days ago, a 10-year-old boy named Marcus walked in. His mother works 2 jobs. He was failing math because there was no one to help him after school. Now he comes to us every day. His last test score, 92%. Michael paused, looking directly at Fisher. These aren't statistics. Mr. Fisher, they're people, with names, with stories, with dignity. Your pharmaceutical initiative might reach more bodies, but our center reaches whole lives. He turned to address the entire board. I understand the appeal of metrics, of scalability, but some things don't scale neatly. Community doesn't scale. Trust doesn't scale. Healing doesn't scale, at least not in the ways your analysts can measure. Catherine stepped forward, seamlessly picking up his thread. What Michael is describing is exactly why Harvest Hope matters. Yes, medication saves lives. We know that, but community sustains them. She tapped her tablet, bringing up a new set of images, architectural renderings of 5 more centers in different neighborhoods. Our proposal isn't to continue just one center. It's to replicate this model with local leadership, local employment, and services tailored to each community's specific needs. It's not charity, it's investment in human capital. Fisher's expression remained skeptical, but Michael noticed several board members leaning forward with renewed interest. And the financial sustainability, someone asked. Catherine nodded to Michael, yielding the floor. The Thompson Center is already trending toward 40% self-sustainability through community partnerships, social enterprise initiatives, and targeted grants. Michael explained, we're on track to reach 60% within 2 years. That's without sacrificing our mission of accessibility. He pulled up one final image, Sophie's original crayon drawing of the center, now framed in the lobby. My daughter drew this before we ever broke ground. A place where nobody's cold and nobody's left out. That's not just a child's wish. That's a viable model for community health. And it works. The room was quiet when he finished. Fisher studied him with narrowed eyes, then shifted his gaze to Catherine. You found quite the advocate. Catherine, he said, voice cooler than before. I didn't find him. Martin, she replied calmly. He found me, when no one else would look. The reference to that night in the ER hung in the air. Most of the board knew the story by now. It had become something of a legend within North Star's walls. Fisher sighed. Touching as this all is, emotion doesn't drive sound fiscal policy. An older woman near the middle of the table, Dr. Eleanor Winters, if Michael remembered correctly, cleared her throat. Actually, Martin, I'd argue that it absolutely should. Our foundation was established to serve people, not just balance sheets. She turned to Michael. Mr. Thompson, that little girl who drew the picture, she's your daughter. Yes, ma'am, Sophie. And she spends time at the center. Almost every day after school, she thinks she runs the place, he said with a small smile. Dr. Winters nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to visit, see this model in action, before we vote on any reallocation. I'd like that too, added another board member. Fisher's jaw tightened, but he was too skilled a player to show outright frustration. By all means, due diligence is essential. Catherine straightened, seizing the momentum. Then I propose we table this discussion until after the site visits. Say, 2 weeks from today. Heads nodded around the table. Fisher was the last to agree, his consent coming with a slight incline of his head. 2 weeks, he said, and then we'll make a decision based on facts, not feelings. As the meeting adjourned, Catherine and Michael stepped into the hallway. She waited until they were alone in her office before exhaling a long breath. That was too close, she said, sinking into her chair. If you hadn't come, but I did. Michael replied simply, we're partners. Remember? She looked up at him, a smile ghosting across her lips. Partners. He sat across from her, the familiar comfort of their dynamic settling between them. Fisher's not going to give up easily. No, she agreed. He genuinely believes his approach is better, and in some ways it's hard to argue with his logic. A new drug could reach thousands. But would it find Clara Rodriguez in her tiny apartment? Would it make sure Joseph Taylor's heat stayed on? Would it help Marcus with his math homework? Catherine's expression softened. No, that's the point I've been trying to make for years. Health isn't just absence of disease, it's presence of support. Michael leaned forward. So what's our next move? We get ready for those site visits. Show them everything. The good, the challenges, all of it. Authentic, not staged. Fisher will be looking for flaws. Let him look, Catherine said with sudden fierceness. We're not perfect, but we're necessary. Michael studied her face, the determination in her eyes, the slight furrow between her brows that appeared whenever she was strategizing. In the 4 months since the center opened, he'd come to recognize every micro-expression, every tell, just as she'd learned to read his. There's something else, she said after a moment. Something I didn't want to bring up in front of the board? What is it? She tapped a few keys on her computer, then turned the screen toward him. I had Emma do some digging into Fisher's sudden interest in pharmaceutical investment. On the screen was a news article about a company called Neurotech Pharmaceuticals, a small but promising firm developing a new class of pain medications. Fisher's son-in-law is the CEO, Catherine explained. They're looking for major investment to push their leading drug through final trials. Michael's eyes narrowed. So his interest isn't purely about efficiency? It never is, she said wearily. The frustrating part is, the drug actually looks promising. It could help a lot of people. But diverting funds from Harvest Hope isn't the way to support it. Can you bring this up to the board? Catherine shook her head. Not without turning this into a personal battle. Fisher's been with North Star since the beginning. He has allies. We need to win on the merits, not by discrediting him. Michael nodded, understanding the delicate politics at play. Then we make the next 2 weeks count. We show them a vision so compelling they can't say no. Catherine's smile was tired but genuine. When did you get so good at corporate strategy? I learned from the best, he replied, and I've got a lot at stake. Her expression turned curious. The center, that, he agreed, and more. The weight of the unspoken hung between them, the growing connection neither had fully acknowledged but both felt with increasing clarity, before either could say more. Emma appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but your 4 o'clock is here. Catherine. Catherine nodded, straightening. Thank you. Emma, tell them I'll be right there. She turned back to Michael. We'll talk more tomorrow, maybe over dinner after the center closes. I'd like that, he said, as he drove back to Oak Ridge. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at another crossroads, not just for the center, but for whatever was slowly building between them, whatever Fisher's motivations. His challenge had forced them to articulate something essential about their shared vision, about what mattered. Michael pulled into the center's parking lot just as the after-school program was letting out. Children streamed through the doors, backpacks bouncing, voices raised in the peculiar joy of freedom. Among them was Sophie, deep in conversation with an elderly man Michael recognized as Joseph Taylor. He watched as his daughter solemnly handed the old man a folded piece of paper. Joseph opened it, read whatever was written there, and then placed a weathered hand on Sophie's head in what looked like blessing. Michael approached as Joseph was walking away. What was that about, Soph?